For 46 years, Tennessee buried a secret with no name, no headlines, no suspect. Just bones found beside a quiet road in 1978, labeled and shelved, forgotten by time. But here's the question that should never have taken half a century to answer. Who was A, and who put him there? In 2024, modern DNA cracked open a case everyone thought was dead, revealing a U.S. military veteran hidden in plain sight and a truth so close to home, it shattered an entire community. Before we dive into this chilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for the full investigation. Before he became a mystery, before he was reduced to bones and case numbers, Jessie Lee Williamson was a man who existed fully in the world, a voice, a past shaped by discipline, service, and long stretches of silence that only other veterans truly understand. Jessie grew up in the American South during a time when duty was not questioned. Family members would later describe him as steady, not loud, not reckless, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He enlisted young, served his country, and came back change button, not broken. Like many veterans of that era, he returned without fanfare. No paradis, no spotlight. Just a quiet transition back into civilian life. Records show Jessie drifted through Tennessee in the late 1970s. He took short-term work. Light, moved, often. Not because he was hiding, but because that was how he survived. There is no evidence of enemies. No criminal history. No trail that screams danger. And that's what makes this case so unsettling. Somewhere between routine days and ordinary nights, Jessie Bunny said no missing person report was filed. No alarm bells rang. No mother or spouse pushed law enforcement for answers. And that absence of noise would become the first reason this case stayed silent for decades. Jessie was alone in the system. No digital footprint. No social media. No centralized databases. In 1978, if no one came looking, the world simply moved on. Investigators today believe Jessie was likely traveling when he crossed paths with the wrong person. There was no evidence he was involved in risky behavior. No proof of a lifestyle that invited violence, which forces one chilling conclusion. This wasn't chaos. This was opportunity. What's important here isn't just who Jessie was, but what he represented. Veterans like him often fell through the cracks after service. They trusted people. They hitchhiked. They took rides they shouldn't have had to regret. And predators knew that. Jessie's story reminds us of a hard truth. You don't have to be reckless to become a victim. Sometimes, all it takes is being alone at the wrong moment in the wrong place. But at the time, none of this was known. All investigators had in 1978 was a body, and even that, barely. No? Nami. No ID. No answers. The man before he vanished deserved more. And for decades, he never got it. But that brings us to the moment everything went wrong. The first investigation, and the mistakes that locked this case in silence for nearly half a century. When the remains were discovered in 1978, the scene didn't scream urgency. A rural stretch of Tennessee roadway. Sparse traffic. No witnesses. No immediate signs pointing to a suspect. What law enforcement faced that day wasn't just a possible homicide, it was a dead end from the very start. The remains were time had already erased critical details. Cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty. There were no personal belongings that could confirm identity. No wallet. No dog tags. Nothing that tied this man to a home, a family, or even a state. Investigators did what they could with the tools of the era. Dental records were checked. Fingerprints, where possible, were attempted. Missing persons files were searched manually state by state. Everything came up empty. Without an identity, there was no timeline. Without a timeline, there were no suspects. Without suspects, the case stalled. The remains were classified as an unidentified male, a John Doe. Evidence was tagged, boxed, and stored. Not abandoned, just frozen in time. The reality is uncomfortable, but necessary to understand. In the 1970s, cold cases didn't have second lives. Once leads dried up, resources moved on to active threats. There were subtle clues, though bone structure suggested a physically capable adult male. Signs consistent with past physical conditioning hinted at military service, but nothing definitive enough to prove it. And in a cruel irony, the very discipline that once defined Jesse's life may have helped conceal his identity after death. As months turned into years, the file thinned. Detectives retired. Notes were archived. Handwritten reports faded. By the early 1980s, the case was effectively dormant. No press conferences, no task force, no closure. And yet, one thing saved this case from vanishing forever: evidence preservation. Despite limited technology, the department followed protocol. The remains were stored properly. Biological material, though degraded, was not destroyed. That single decision would matter more than anyone realized at the time. For decades, the case lived in silence. Generations passed. Tennessee changed. Roads were repaved. Communities grew. Somewhere nearby, the truth continued to breathe. The failure of the first investigation wasn't negligence. It was limitation. Law enforcement had hit a ceiling they didn't yet know how to break. DNA databases didn't exist. Forensic genealogy was science fiction. The idea that a name could be pulled from genetic code decades later was unimaginable. This is where many cases truly die, not from indifference, but from time. But time, as it turns out, was only waiting. Because nearly half a century later, a new generation of investigators would reopen a box no one had touched in decades, and inside it, they'd find the one thing technology was finally ready for. A voice hidden in DNA, still waiting to be heard. For decades, this case existed in a kind of suspended animation. Not closed, not active, just waiting. Locked inside an evidence room were the remains and materials that no one in 1978 could truly speak for, but which were never allowed to. Disappeared. That decision changed everything. The evidence collected back then was minimal, but crucial. Skeletal remains, trace biological material, notes from the original recovery scene. At the time, these items told investigators almost nothing, but modern detectives understand a hard truth. Evidence doesn't lose its value. Technology just has to catch up. By the early 2000s, forensic science had evolved, but not enough. DNA testing required cleaner samples, fresher tissue, better preservation than this case could provide. Each time the evidence was reviewed, the conclusion was the same. Not yet. And so the file went back on the shelf. What's important to understand here is restraint. Investigators didn't force the science. They didn't contaminate samples chasing impossible results. They waited. That patience is rare in high-profile cases. But in cold cases, patience is survival. Over the years, small annotations were added to the file. Possibility of military background. Adult. Male. Likely. Transient. No obvious trauma, consistent with accidental death. The word homicide appeared, with a question mark next to it. Unconfirmed, but suspected. The silence of the evidence was frustrating. No witnesses came forward. No tips arrived. No confessions surfaced. Whoever was responsible never spoke. Not once. Then came the quiet shift. In the late 2010s, forensic genealogy began rewriting the rules of criminal investigation. Old cases decades old were suddenly being solved, not through witnesses or confessions, but through family trees. The dead were being identified by relatives who didn't even know they were connected to a crime. This case was flagged again. Detectives reviewed the evidence inventory line by line. Could anything still yield DNA? Could anything survive modern extraction techniques? The answer was uncertain, but for the first time in 40 years, it wasn't impossible. A request was made to an advanced forensic laboratory specializing in severely degraded samples. The remains were re-examined with a single goal: not to find the killer, just to find a name. That distinction matters. Because identification is justice's first step, the process was slow, painfully slow. DNA extraction from decades-old skeletal material is unstable, unpredictable. It can fail dozens of times before succeeding once. Months passed. Then more months. Updates were cautious. No promises were made. But behind the scenes, something was happening. Fragments of genetic code, once considered useless, were being read. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to open a door. And once that door opened, the silence that had protected this case for 46 years began to crack. Because DNA doesn't just identify the dead, it points toward the living. And that reality would soon pull an entirely new set of people into a mystery they never knew existed. Cold cases don't solve themselves. They're solved by people willing to care long after everyone else has moved on. By the time this case was reopened, none of the original investigators were still active. Some had retired. Some had passed away. What remained was a file, a box of evidence, and a decision made by modern detectives to treat an unnamed victim with the same urgency as a fresh crime scene. This wasn't nostalgia, it was accountability. A small team was assembled, detectives trained specifically in cold case methodology. Their approach was different. They weren't chasing leads. They were rebuilding context, reconstructing decisions, questioning assumptions made decades earlier, not to assign blame, but to find opportunity. Earlier, not to assign blame, but to find opportunity. They started with geography. Why this location? Why here? Maps were digitized. Old road layouts overlaid with modern ones. Traffic patterns analyzed. What once seemed remote in 1978 might not have been accidental at all. Then came behavioral analysis. If this was homicide, it wasn't impulsive. The body was left in a place where discovery would be delayed, but not impossible. That suggested familiarity, comfort, someone who knew the area well enough to take the risk. The detectives didn't have a name yet, but they had a working theory. The victim didn't come from here, but the perpetrator likely did. When the DNA lab confirmed partial genetic data could be used, the investigation entered its most delicate phase. Forensic genealogy, a tool that doesn't just search databases, it rebuilds families. This is where modern detectives become part investigator, part historian, using public genealogy data. Analysts began identifying distant relatives linked to the DNA profile. Second, cousins. Third, cousins. People completely unaware that by submitting DNA years earlier, they had created a path toward uncovering a violent crime. Family trees expanded outward, branch by branch. Names appeared. Locations clustered. Patterns emerged. Detectives worked quietly. No media. No leaks. Every step was verified twice. Because genealogy doesn't accuse, it suggests. And suggestion isn't evidence. As the family tree narrowed, one line stood out. A man with a history that intersected Tennessee in the late 1970s. No criminal record. No obvious red flags. The kind of person no one would ever suspect. Which is exactly why this method works. A detective slowed everything down. Surveillance was conducted legally. Records were pulled. Old employment histories reviewed. Military rosters checked. Then came confirmation. Discarded DNA from a public source was legally obtained and tested. When the results came back, they didn't just match. They aligned. The unnamed man from 1978, now had a name. And the detectives finally understood the scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just an identification. It was a 46-year secret, hiding in plain sight. And once the name was confirmed, the investigation shifted instantly. Cold case to active arrest planning, because the truth had finally caught up. And it was about to shock everyone who thought they already knew the story. The most dangerous assumption in any cold case is that time erases truth. This investigation proved the opposite. When forensic specialists began working with the skeletal remains, they weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for survival. After 46 years, DNA doesn't exist as a clean strand. It exists as fragments, broken, fragile, incomplete. Most cases fail at this stage. This one didn't. Advanced extraction techniques, targeted bone and tooth samples, known to protect genetic material longest. The process took weeks, then months. Every step risked contamination, degradation, or total loss. Analysts worked slowly, deliberately, knowing there would be no second chance. And then it happened. A viable genetic profile emerged, not complete, but usable. Enough to speak. That profile didn't go into a criminal database first. It couldn't. There was no prior arrest record. Instead, it entered a different world. Public ancestry databases. Vast, voluntary networks created for family history, not crime solving. This is where science becomes uncomfortable. Forensic genetic genealogy doesn't ask who did it. It asks who shares blood. The result is never a name. It's a web. A sprawling network of distant relatives spread across states and generations. Analysts began building upward and outward. Great-grandparents, siblings, migration paths, census records, military enlistments, obituaries, marriage licenses. Every document became a potential clue. Slowly, the web tightened. What stood out wasn't criminal behavior, it was normal life. Jobs, families, community involvement. That's what made the breakthrough so unnerving. The DNA didn't point toward a monster hiding in darkness. It pointed towards someone who blended in perfectly. At T's point, detectives faced a critical responsibility. Science had opened a door, but law had to walk through it carefully. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Each potential individual identified through genealogy was eliminated systematically using timeline analysis. Who could physically be in Tennessee in 1978? Who had access to transportation? Who matched the biological profile? One name kept surviving the process. When investigators overlaid military records with genealogical data, confirmation followed. The unidentified remains belonged to a veteran long believed lost to time, Jessie Lee Williamson. The moment his name was confirmed, this case stopped being about bones and evidence. It became about a man whose life had been erased twice, once by violence and again by anonymity. But DNA doesn't stop at identification. It points forward. If Jessie had been killed, someone caused it, and if that person was alive. DNA had just shortened a 46-year head start to zero. Identifying Jessie Lee Williamson was only the beginning. Now investigators had to answer the most dangerous question of all. Who was with him at the end? This phase of the investigation didn't happen in the field. It happened on screens, archives, and spreadsheets. A digital autopsy of relationships, where forensic genealogy becomes true detective work. The family tree built to identify Jessie was expanded 10 rivers. Instead of asking who Jessie was related to, analysts asked who intersected his life path geographically and socially in 1978. That required reconstruction. Detectives mapped Jessie's likely movements based on employment patterns common to veterans at the time. Temporary jobs, transit routes, known gathering points, military assistance centers, bars frequented by service members, locations where trust formed, quickly on disappeared just as fast. Witnesses from the era were nearly impossible to find. Memory fade, records vanish, but patterns den singual. T.1 location kept resurfacing, a place consistent with Jessie's final known movements and the disposal site of his remains, a place locals would know intimately. Now investigators shifted focus from victim to environment. Who lived there in 1978? Who worked nights? Who had privacy? Who had transportation? Property records were reviewed. Employment files requested. Old newspaper classifieds scanned for job listings. Old pieces of a life long gone, reconstructed out of necessity. This wasn't about catching a killer through aggression. It was about eliminating everyone who couldn't be responsible. The family tree logic applied again, but this time, 2 potential suspects. Relatives were interviewed quietly. Backgrounds were cross-checked. Any inconsistencies flagged, not presumed. And then a timeline matched too well to ignore. One individual lived nearby, had access to the road. No criminal history. No reason to ever be suspected. They had aged into respectability, built a life, raised a family. For decades, they'd existed as just another member of the community. DNA, however, doesn't recognize reinvention. When investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample through legal channels, the results weren't surprising. They were definitive. The genetic material matched the profile linked to Jessie's homicide. No speculation. No partial alignment. A direct connection. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't coincidence. It was math. At that moment, the investigation crossed an invisible line, from history into consequence. Detectives didn't rush. They documented everything. Every procedural step. Because a case built over 46 years deserves to end correctly. When the arrest plan was finalized, only a handful of people knew. No warning, no leaks. Because what was coming wasn't just an arrest, it was a reckoning. The kind that doesn't just solve a case but rewrites the past for everyone who thought this story had ended decades ago. And when the name was finally made public, one truth became unavoidable. Time hadn't hidden this crime, it had only been waiting for science to catch up. When the confirmation came, it didn't arrive with sirens or celebration. It came quietly, in a report, typed verified, signed. After 46 years, John Doe was no longer a case number. He was Jessie Lee Williamson. For investigators, this moment matters more than any arrests, because before justice can be served, dignity must be restored. A man who had served his country, then vanished without explanation, was finally acknowledged as real, as someone who mattered. The notification process was handled with care. Genealogical links led detectives to surviving relatives some distant. some closer than expected. For many, Jessie was a name from old conversations. A person mentioned once, then lost to time. They'd never imagined his fate, let alone this ending. Family members were briefed privately. No cameras, no press, just facts. What was known, what could never be known, and what was finally certain, Jesse didn't disappear by choice. He didn't die, forgotten. He was taken. A headstone was arranged. Military service acknowledged. Records corrected. For the first time since 1978, Jesse's life and death occupied the same timeline. From an investigative standpoint, this was also the moment the case officially shifted classification. No longer unidentified remains. No longer suspected homicide. This was now a named victim in an active murder investigation. That distinction carries weight. It allows prosecutors to act. It gives detectives authority. And it gives the public a face to attach to the truth. Analysts re-examined every piece of evidence through this new lens. Jesse's background, his service history, his likely state of mind in the final weeks of his life. Nothing was left to assumption. But perhaps the most powerful change was invisible. Cases with names get attention. Cases with names get remembered. For 46 years, this file had been quiet because it lacked a voice. That voice had finally been restored, and with it came momentum, because now that Jesse had his name back, the investigation turned to the person who had quietly carried this secret for nearly half a century. Someone who'd lived comfortably inside the gap, created by anonymity. That gap was closing. Arrests in cold cases rarely happen the way people imagine. There's no chase, no dramatic confession, just a knock on the door and the weight of decades stepping inside. When investigators moved in, the suspect was living a routine life. Same neighborhood, same patterns. A life built slowly, carefully, while this crime slept in silence. No one around them suspected a thing. That's why the arrest shook the community. Neighbors described the suspect as normal, dependable, the kind of person you'd pass into a grocery store without a second glance. Someone who had attended local events, lived without incident. A presence so ordinary it felt untouchable. Detectives executed the arrest with precision. Documentation was airtight. DNA results confirmed. Timelines aligned. Every box checked when questioned. The suspect didn't react with shock. That, in itself, spoke volumes. This wasn't confusion. This was recognition. Details of the accusation followed. Jesse had trusted someone who knew the area better than he did. Someone who understood how to leave no witnesses and, for decades, no answers. Once the arrest became public, the story moved fast. Media coverage exploded. A case forgotten for nearly half a century was suddenly front-page news. But the real impact happened quietly. Families reevaluated memories. Conversations replayed in people's minds. The realization settled in that justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it does, it rewrites everything. Prosecutors emphasized the role of DNA and forensic genealogy. This wasn't about luck. It was about science catching up, about evidence preserved long enough to speak. The defense had little room to maneuver. DNA doesn't misremember. It doesn't forget. And unlike witnesses, it doesn't change its story. For law enforcement, this arrest represented more than a solved case. It was a message. Time no longer guarantees escape. Anonymity is temporary, and the past is never truly buried. Jessie Lee Williamson's case had lived through nearly 5 decades of silence, through technological limits, through institutional change, through the assumption that some answers are simply lost. It wasn't. When the suspect was led away, there were no cheers, just stillness. The kind that follows a truth finally revealed. And for the first time since 1978, Tennessee didn't have a question anymore. It had an answer. But answers, as this case proves, don't bring relief alone. They bring responsibility, accountability, and for a community that thought this chapter was closed, the realization that some stories don't end quietly. They wait. Courtrooms have their own atmosphere. Not loud, not dramatic. Heavy. When this case finally entered the legal system, there was no denying its age, but there was also no denying its strength. Decades-old files were reopened, scanned, digitized, and reconstructed for a modern jury. One tut. Hadn't been alive when Jessie Lee Williamson disappeared. Prosecutors didn't rush the story. They framed it carefully. This wasn't just a murder case. It was a failure of time, corrected by science, a demonstration of how patience, preservation, and technology intersect. The defense focused on the obvious argument delay. Too much time had passed. Memories faded. Contexts changed. But DNA doesn't age the way people do. It doesn't weaken under pressure. And it doesn't negotiate. Expert witnesses explained forensic genealogy in clear terms. How DNA survives in bone. How family trees are built backward. How probability becomes certainty. Tehuri didn't need spectacle. They needed clarity. And clarity is exactly what this case delivered. The courtroom remained quiet as evidence was presented. No outbursts. No gasps. Just absorption. The weight of 46 years pressing forward. Finally, demanding acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, the community struggled to process what this meant. A person they'd known, seen, trusted, dismissed as harmless was now tied directly to a murder buried since the Carter administration. That kind of revelation doesn't fade quickly. For law enforcement, this moment validated every decision made to preserve evidence when there were no answers. For Jessie's family, it wasn't closure in the cinematic sense, but it was truth. And truth carries its own gravity. The case sent a message far beyond Tennessee. Cold cases are not archives. They're waiting rooms. And eventually, someone is called forward. As proceedings moved toward resolution, one fact remained unshakable. Jessie Lee Williamson was no longer invisible. His story was no longer unfinished. Justice may have arrived late, but it arrived intact. The final chapter of this story doesn't happen in a courtroom or a lab. It happens quietly. A grave marker now carries Jessie Lee Williamson's name. Dates etched in stone. Service acknowledged. Identity restored. What was once an unnamed resting place is now a destination, one that confirms he existed and that he mattered. For decades, Jesse was known only through absence. Now, he's remembered through truth. This case isn't just about a solved mystery. It's about accountability outrunning time. About how science gave a voice to someone silence tried to erase. And about the warning this sends to anyone who believes the past stays buried. It doesn't. Somewhere, another box sits on another shelf. Another case waits up. And because of this story, we know what's possible. 40-6 years later, a name slept no more. Cold cases are often described as unsolvable, forgotten, invisible. But Jessie Lee Williamson's story proves that nothing truly disappears. For investigators, the lesson is clear. Patience isn't passive. It's deliberate. Evidence may seem dormant. Files may gather dust. But every piece carries a story. And when combined with evolving technology, those pieces can rewrite history. Detectives emphasized the human side of the investigation. Families must be treated with care. Communities must be informed thoughtfully. Justice delayed is still justice, but respect, empathy, and discretion define how it arrives. Forensic genetic genealogy has become a powerful tool, but it is also delicate. Lives can be reshaped by a single match. Professionals must weigh every decision, ensuring that truth and ethics move in tandem. One misstep can turn revelation into tragedy. The case also highlighted resilience. 46 years passed without a resolution, yet persistence, rigor, and belief in science finally prevailed. It is a reminder that cold cases are never truly cold. Wait for someone who refuses to forget. Ultimately, the narrative is more than crime solving. It is a testament to memory, identity, and justice. Jesse is no longer just a file number. He's a veteran, a man remembered, a life acknowledged, and his story is a blueprint for how diligence can outlast decades. Time is often seen as an enemy of justice. It erodes memory. It buries evidence. It creates doubt. But in this story, time became a silent witness. 40-6 years passed before Jesse's name During that time, the investigation remained alive in quiet rooms, in dedicated detectives' minds, in notes waiting for new eyes. Each year strengthened the importance of evidence, preservation, of procedure, and of integrity. For the community, this case was a mirror. It reflected how ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary secrets. It revealed the hidden consequences of trust betrayed, the weight of unresolved loss, and the profound impact of finally naming the unnamed. Jessie Lee Williamson's identification transformed decades of uncertainty into clarity. His life, stolen prematurely, was reclaimed through science, ethics, and relentless detective work. The perpetrator's exposure reminded the public that truth cannot be evaded indefinitely. And while the courtroom delivered accountability, the broader lesson resonates beyond legal boundaries. Preservation matters. Patience matters. Technology matters. But most of all, dedication matters. Every detective, analyst, and genealogist involved understood that the final verdict was as much about honoring a life as punishing a crime. Time bore witness, and in the end, it validated every effort, every hypothesis, every painstaking step toward justice. Jessie's story is now complete, not because the years were short, but because they were respected in cold cases. Time is not the enemy, it is the final witness. It waits, it observes, and when the truth is finally ready, it speaks with unmistakable clarity. Justice may not always be swift, but it is inevitable when met with perseverance, science, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. 40-6 years later, a name, a life, and a story slept no more. A life and a story slept no more.